Hello, I'm James Cary. Welcome to The Sacred Art of Joking, a book, a blog, a podcast, and a series of YouTube videos. And this is another one. Thanks very much for being with me. And so I just want to tell you about The Sacred Art of Joking, the book first. I think we're going to have lots of stuff to talk about as news continues to break and things seem to happen and people get offended and jokes go wrong. And actually, sometimes jokes go right and people don't like them going right. So there's lots of issues to talk about here. But let me just fill you in on the book and how this might fill out some of those corners in terms of understanding it and dealing with them. It's not a long book. It's only about 160 pages. It's an easy read. There's a lovely foreword by Milton Jones, a comedian and a Christian man who I've worked with a lot, and is a very funny man. So he's done a little foreword there, and then a preface, which I talked about in the last episode. And then there are sort of instructions as to how to read the book. I know it sounds a bit ridiculous, but I mean, you could just go through it and pick out the chapters you like. And for example, there's a chapter about why it's okay to make jokes about Christianity, but not Islam. And I've even sort of said in the chapter that, you know, that you probably turn to this chapter first, and that a lot of the stuff won't make sense unless you read the stuff that goes before. How you want to read it, of course, is up to you. It's your book. But the first part, there are three parts. The first part is called A Good Sense of Humour, and it's about how comedy works. And this is pretty much where I've been making a living for the last 20 years, writing comedy, sitcoms for the BBC and script editing, and for CBBC and CBeebies as well. And also live shows like The God Particle and The Monk's Tale. And I'm writing a new show called A Turbulent Priest for 2019-2020 about Thomas Becket and his murder in 1117. So I spend a lot of time thinking about why jokes work and why they don't work. And there are so many ways in which a joke can go wrong, as we explore in that part of the book. And also talk about stereotyping and how jokes require information to be presented very quickly. And so stereotypes are very useful for compressing information and giving you a type so that your joke works. And actually there's often very little malice intended behind the stereotype. And so look at that, and also how times change, how the people telling jokes to each other change and have different relationships with the things that they're joking with. And I often describe comedy as like trying to get from one moving car from another moving car via a third moving car. Because the backdrop is changing all the time. And so a joke that seems funny now may seem very, very rude or offensive in 10 or 15 years' time. And stuff that actually seemed quite politically correct 10 or 15 years ago now can actually seem quite inappropriate or a little bit creepy or something like that. That's particularly the case with some sitcoms from the past that haven't aged well. And yet, interestingly, I mentioned Blackadder in the last episode. Blackadder doesn't date particularly because it's set in the past. It's already historical, and so loads of issues going on here. And so I go into that in part one of the book, hopefully with some jokes, and it's a fun read. And then in part two of the book, I talk about comedy and the church, and why the church and comedy are unhappy bedfellows, shall we say. And you know, the church is not a place where you're going to expect to laugh. The church is not renowned for having a particularly good sense of humour. And so I look at that and work out whether Christians probably are too easily offended and actually sometimes trying to be holier than Jesus, and how that went for people who were holier than Jesus. And I look at Jesus and I talk about, was he funny? And that's the thing that lots of press people sort of ask about quite a lot. I was on the BBC Sunday programme the other day with Edward Sturton, and he was asking me whether Jesus was funny or not, and I was trying to say that he was, and I don't think Edward Sturton believed me. But there we go, you can't have everything. It was 7:30 on a Sunday morning, and not that much is terribly funny at 7:30 on a Sunday morning. But also one of the ways in which the church don't do comedy well is because church seems to be serious. And that's probably no bad thing, that it's the default setting is serious. And I'm also not trying to argue that Jesus was a stand-up comedian. It's obviously very easy if you're a specialist to want to see everything through that lens. So I'm not saying that Jesus was a stand-up comedian, but I'm saying that he was funny, and that he but also not only did he say funny things, but he did funny things, and he did funny things because he was God. He is God, and therefore he almost behaves like a superhero. And superheroes we used to find funny, and now they're all very po-faced and serious, and they make very expensive blockbuster movies about them. So in the book I look at that and how the incarnation, how Jesus being born as a baby, is in itself comic, and other popular world religions don't like the fact that God becomes man, because to them it's inherently ridiculous. It's sort of so funny and ridiculous it can't possibly be true. And then we get on to talk about why Islam is harder to make jokes about, but not for reasons that you might expect. It's not for fear, because if you know any comedians, they're people who tend to be pretty fearless, and they kind of revel in stirring things up and getting a reaction out of people. They don't really make jokes about Islam because no one gets them, because the details of Islam are not widely known in terms of practice and all that kind of stuff compared to Christianity. So we can talk about that in more detail in a future episode. So then I look at why you shouldn't start a sermon with a joke. So if you're a preacher, it's easy to sort of import jokes to make church funny or to make the Bible funny, and actually that's giving the impression that there's nothing inherently joyous or funny about the Bible, and I think that's a bit of a mistake. And actually one thing we need to do, that Christians need to do, is to recover a sense of biblical comedy, because there's tons of funny stuff in the Bible where lots of strange and funny things happen, and there's lots of irony and lots of extraordinary moments, and so I go into those as well. So that's part 2, comedy in the church. And then part 3 is sort of looking a bit more widely about things that have become issues in the popular culture, but are also kind of related to Christian stuff to a greater or lesser extent. So I look at the pug dog incident with Count Dankula, and how his being prosecuted for a joke, which I personally find very distasteful. I get the joke that making a beautiful little pug dog do a Nazi salute is funny, but it uses a phrase that I think is pretty hard work, but I don't think should be a crime. I just think it's a sin, and sins are not crimes. But again, that's one for another time. And then I look in fairly big detail at Jerry Springer the Opera, which has sort of come and gone, and it's kind of a good example, if you like, of a test case really of offence and blasphemy, and how Christians can respond, and what happened. So in that section I look at what people were offended about and why, and how they responded, and whether that was a reasonable response, and whether that's something that we want to be doing more of in the future or less. I think I would argue less. And then comparing that to the Book of Mormon musical, where the Mormon church, such that it is a church, have taken on, decided to have a bit of a sense of humour about it. And I suspect they find it deeply offensive, but they've done their best to smile sweetly and take it on the chin, as Mormons tend to, because they tend to be extremely nice people. And whether that actually is a better look for Christians, even though we don't have to say we're not offended by something, there are ways I think we can behave which are slightly more endearing and biblical. And then I finish up with an even more strange and problematic thing, which is about why Easter is funny. And there are some videos on this YouTube channel, actually, on my YouTube channel, and on my website, which you can look at to get a bit more information about that. And all of the absurdities and ironies about Easter, the fact that Jesus was prosecuted for blasphemy, and yet how can you be prosecuted for blasphemy if you are actually God? So there are lots of things that are not sort of laugh out loud funny, as it were, but they are comic. And there used to be a tradition in the medieval church of laughing at the devil at Easter, because he'd been tricked into having Jesus crucified, and there's some merit in that view about Satan being tricked, but I think there are also some problems with it. So I look at that in the book too. So that's a very quick fly through, fly past, fly over, whatever you want to call it, of the sacred art of joking, which I hope people will like, and if they can read it, they might engage more with the stuff that I'll be talking about on this show, on the sacred art of joking, because comedy is becoming news all the time, and I think people are starting to lose their minds. And the most important things are context and offensiveness, and that being offended is not actually a sin, or is not necessarily as bad as you might think it is, even though it sometimes hurts. So those are all chats for another time. In the meantime, thanks very much for being with me on the Sacred Art of Joking show. The book is out this month in the UK in January, and in March in the US via IVP, SBCK in the UK. And you can pre-order a copy from me at my website, jamescary.co.uk, if you're in the UK, and I will even sign it for you if you want, or you can put me a note to say, please don't sign it. I don't want you scrawling all over my book, which is completely fine. It's your book. Do what you like with it. And you can also get it from Amazon as usual, but I'll stick some links in the show notes and below if you like. And then I'll speak to you next time. Thanks very much for being with me. Speak to you next time.